Hello, COP 1000 students. Dennis here. I'm going to do a quick video on mixedMath. I'm going to do it in Python, but in general, different programming languages may handle mixedMath slightly different. But again, I'm going to demonstrate mixedMath in Python. So the concern would be if you do math with integers and real numbers, what would be the result? Is the result going to be an integer or a real number? And that result would be important depending on what you are coding. So here's an example of some mixed math. If I take an integer and I add it to a float, I should get a float. If I add two integers, I should get an integer. And this last one down here, if I add an int and a float, I get a float. But then I can convert that float back into an integer. So here's a little tiny Python program that adds two values, an integer and a float. So if I take an integer, which is 8, and a float, which is 2.6, add them together, my result's going to be a float. So again, an integer plus a float is a float. So now the question is, what happens when I add two integers? So if I add an integer value 8 to an integer value 2, I'm going to add those, and what is the result going to be? It's going to be an integer. So repeating, an integer plus an integer returns an integer. So we know if we add an integer and a float, we get a float. For example, 8 plus 266 returns a float. But in this example, I can take whatever that float was and I can convert it with a function into an integer. So even though this returns a float, I'm displaying it as an int. And if I use this in math, I would treat it as an int. So we could take something that results in a float and we can reverse that back to an int. So int float is integer, float is float, float of an int is a float. So now let's do some mixed math using division. This is floating point division, and this is integer division. So in floating point division, no matter what's on either side, it's going to return a float. No matter what's on either side, it's going to return a float. And in integer division, no matter what's on either side, it'll always return an integer. Sorry about that. So if I take an integer plus an integer, or integer divided by an integer using floating point division, I always get a float. So anytime I use floating point, I get a float. If I do the same thing with an int and a float, 8 divided by 2.66, I get a float. Changing from floating point division to integer division, an int divided by a float, I'm sorry, that needs to have, let me fix it. I forgot to change this in my output, so there it is. So if I take an int divided by a float using integer division, I will get an integer. What the heck just happened? Okay, so what I said a minute ago was not correct. Let's fix it. If I take an integer and I use integer division dividing it by a floating point number, I will get integer division, meaning chopping off anything remaining. So I get the result with no decimal place, with no values to the right of the decimal place, but it actually does return a floating point number. So the integer chops off the values to the right of the decimal, but it does return a floating point. The only time integer division doesn't return a floating point number chopped off is if it's two ints. So if I take an int divided by an int, I get an int. So over here I did fix my integer division. So if I use integer division with mixed or floats of any kind, it always returns a float. If I use integer division with integers, it always returns an integer. Just remember, these two floats will have a decimal point, but it'll always be a 0 to the right. Let's look at the modulus operator, which returns the remainder of a division. So if I mod two ints, I get an int, but if I mod anything else with a float on any side, I will always get a float. But again, it'll still be the remainder. Let's take a look. So here is modding an int by an int. So if I take 25 and I use modulus division by 7, so 7 goes into 25 3 times with a remainder of 4, and that is an integer. Notice if I take the integer 25 and just add a dot 0, that's now treating it as a float, and the result is still 4, but it's a floating point. And then again, if I mod two floats, this number mod this number, I get a floating point result. So a quick summary in mixed math is you should test. You're not expected to memorize how mixed math works in a particular programming language, but you are expected to know the pitfalls and to test your results to ensure you get the expected result. So test. Remember, mixed math is different in various languages. You can refer to this slideshow/video anytime you need to. I think that's it. See you in the next one.